There's a tendency people have to collapse very different experiences into one thing. They call it stress or burnout or depression. And depending on who's talking, those words can cover anything from a rough week at work to something genuinely life threatening. That might seem harmless, but it creates a real problem because when everything gets lumped into the same category, people lose the ability to see what's actually happening. And when you can't see it clearly, your response is going to miss. Either you underreact to something serious because you assume it's just stress, or you start treating something completely natural like it's a crisis. So today, I want to try to draw some clearer lines. Not clinical lines, not diagnostic labels, but just a clearer map so you can identify where you are and understand what kind of response actually makes sense. So let's start with stress. Stress isn't the enemy. In a lot of situations, it's your body doing exactly what it's supposed to do, responding to demands, rising to meet something. It's often temporary and it's often functional. You feel it as tension, maybe as distraction or irritability. But here's the thing, even in the middle of it, you still know who you are. You still know what you're moving through. And most of the time, when that situation resolves, the stress resolves with it. The problem isn't stress itself. The problem is stress that never lets up, stress that compounds, stress that's never managed, because that's when it starts to turn into something else entirely. Think about someone who's had a brutal stretch at work. They're sleeping less, reacting to things they'd normally let slide, but they still understand what's going on and they still expect that once things calm down, they'll come back to themselves. And that expectation, well, it's usually right, but that leads to the second category, which is emotional distress. This is where things start to look a little different. It might be triggered by the same kinds of circumstances as normal stress, but it starts to feel more internal. It's more persistent and it's really hard to shake. Things that used to bother you now feel heavier, and the process of coming back down, well, that doesn't happen automatically anymore. You can still have moments of clarity, moments where things feel normal, but they're not guaranteed. And a lot of your energy is going just toward keeping yourself functional. This is usually when people start to notice that something is off. But because it still feels familiar, still feels like the kind of hard they've dealt with before, they can keep reaching for the same old tools. Sometimes these tools work and sometimes they don't. And whether they work depends a lot on whether you've actually moved into a different category without realizing it. A common version of this looks like someone who wakes up already feeling behind. They get through the day, they sleep, they rest, but the weight doesn't lift. It's just still there. That leads us to thinking about depression. And I want to be clear here because depression is not just intense sadness. That distinction really matters. Sadness is reactive. It's connected to something specific and it moves, it shifts and it transforms. Depression is more like a flatness, a dimming, a decrease in motivation and interest in that sense of connection to things that used to feel meaningful. It can distort your sense of time, it can make ordinary things feel like they require enormous effort, and the strategies that used to help, they may not work the same way anymore. The idea of just pushing through becomes a lot less viable, and the need for outside support becomes a lot more real. Here's a simple example of what this can look like. Someone stops reaching out to people they care about, not because they don't want connection, but because initiating that contact feels disproportionately hard. And the reward that used to come from it just doesn't feel accessible. Depression left unaddressed can lead to crisis. Crisis isn't just the most intense version of what came before, but it's a different category altogether. Here, safety becomes the central issue. This is where thoughts or behaviors start to turn inward towards self harm, toward escape, or where someone's ability to safely navigate their own life becomes genuinely compromised. And crises aren't always loud. That's part of what makes them dangerous. They can be silent, interior, hidden behind a completely ordinary looking surface. And at this point, the goal is no longer self management, it's stabilization. And that almost always requires someone else. Someone can look like they're functioning just fine, but privately, they're thinking about escaping their reality. That person may be in crisis. Now, the big takeaway here is that these are not interchangeable states. People can move between them, but the experience is different, and what resolves it is different. And when there's a mismatch, when someone applies the tools from one category to a completely different one, it doesn't just fail to help, it can make things worse. It can make someone feel like their experience isn't real or like something is wrong with them for not responding the way they should. The point isn't to categorize perfectly. The point is to orient yourself so that the response actually fits what's happened. Now, I want to talk about a few specific populations because it matters. Military personnel, veterans, first responders, law enforcement, these groups consistently show higher rates of depression, substance use, and suicidal ideation than the general population. And it's probably not a mystery why. These are people who have been exposed to high stress environments, often repeatedly, often over years, inside cultures that prize performance, resilience, and self reliance. Cultures where asking for help can feel like a weakness. A police officer who ends a shift after a string of high adrenaline calls, or someone returning from deployment trying to readjust to a quieter life, they haven't just been under stress. Their nervous systems have been shaped by that exposure over time. That doesn't mean everyone in these groups will struggle in the same way, but it does mean we need to understand what prolonged stress actually does, not just in a moment, but over time. And that brings me to neuroplasticity. The brain changes based on what it's exposed to. The more you repeat certain thoughts, behaviors, and emotional responses, the more automatic they become, the more hardwired they can get. That's not abstract. It means that the patterns you reinforce over and over are the ones that start to run on autopilot. And yes, that works for helpful patterns too. That's the hopeful part in all of this. So, where does that leave us when it comes to self help versus actually getting help? There's absolutely a place for self help. In the stress category and in some cases of emotional distress, the things you do on your own genuinely matter: sleep, nutrition, movement, reducing unnecessary stimulation. These aren't small things, they're foundational. And if you can actually implement them at a level your situation requires, that might be enough. But there's a point where it's not enough, when you've tried the strategies and nothing's shifting. When your ability to regulate yourself has broken down, and when there's any question of safety, at that point, continuing to treat it as something you can fix alone isn't strength, it's a mismatch. When someone reaches that point, whether it's you or someone you care about, the goal changes. Insight takes a back seat, optimization takes a back seat, and what moves to the front is safety and connection. In practical terms, stay close. Remove any immediate risk if they're present, and don't let the person be alone. Ask directly how they're doing and let the conversation go where it needs to go rather than steering it away from it. Offer to stay in contact rather than rushing to anything, and get additional support involved: someone trusted, a professional, or even a crisis line. If you're the one in crisis, I know this is harder, but the same principle applies. This is not the moment to go quiet. This is really the moment to reach out. Even one person, even one resource, that's enough to break the isolation, and that's enough to create an opening. Fighting the good fight in this context means staying engaged with the process, even when it's unclear and even when it takes longer than you expected. But it also means fighting for accuracy. Because if you misread where you are, the responses won't fit, and a response that doesn't fit the problem doesn't help. When you can see the difference between what you're experiencing and what it looks like on the surface, that's when you actually start to find your way through it. This is uncommonly remarkable. Thanks for listening.